The sun hung low over Clearwater Lake, its reflection trembling on the rippled surface like a half-forgotten dream. I had bought the Lakehouse 2 years ago, a modest-looking cabin from the outside, but inside, a carefully renovated escape worth $515,000. Every cent earned from my long years of grinding, saving, and rebuilding after failure. It stood on a bluff of smooth granite and cedar trees, its deck overlooking the glistening water where loons often called at dusk. The air smelled of pine and clean damp wood. The kind of smell that carried peace I had paid for in sacrifices no one else had seen. That's why, when my parents said they wanted to visit, I hadn't suspected anything unusual. Visits happened. They'd come before, admired the polished flooring, the new boathouse, the shimmering lake that caught sunlight like shards of glass. But this visit was different. It started with a tone in my mother's voice, soft, rehearsed, almost theatrical. "We can't wait to see your lake house again," she'd said, and my father had added something about helping with upkeep. I hadn't thought twice. I was proud, maybe a little too proud, of what I'd built. Pride makes people blind. The morning they arrived, my mother's SUV pulled into the gravel drive with the crunch of tires that sounded permanent, like roots taking hold. The back seat was piled with boxes, kitchen utensils, folded blankets, family photos still in their frames. My stomach turned before my mind caught up. It didn't take long for the announcement. "We've decided," my mother said later that day, standing in the living room as if she were claiming territory. "We're moving in." They said it with smiles like it was a surprise party. And then came the part that twisted the knife deeper. "We promised your sister too." My sister, Rebecca, the golden child who always had a net to catch her. She just divorced for the second time, burned through savings, and now apparently, she had a promise made not by me, but about me. They had told her she could live here, at my lake house. In that instant, every quiet evening I'd cherished here, the evenings where the light faded softly across the lake and the air turned glassy with calm, felt suddenly invaded. Every corner of my peace filled with the noise of expectations I never agreed to. They framed it like a family thing, a temporary stay until Rebecca got back on her feet. But the way they unpacked the boxes, the way my father nodded at the view and said, "We could get used to this," it all told another story. By nightfall, the house didn't feel like mine anymore. I spent the night staring out the window, the lake black as ink, reflecting only the pale glow of the moon. Somewhere deep down, a line had been crossed, but I hadn't yet found the words or the courage to draw it back. Because in my family, saying no was always branded as cruelty. The next morning, my mother was making coffee in my kitchen, as if she had always belonged there. My father was measuring the deck railing, already talking about improvements. Rebecca's voice drifted from the guest room, humming, unpacking, making herself at home. The air in the house had changed. Ownership no longer felt like possession. It felt like responsibility, guilt, and quiet suffocation. I told myself I'd let them stay a few days. I told myself I wouldn't make a scene. But I also knew this. Once they settled in, they'd never leave. And that knowledge burned hotter than any resentment I'd ever felt before. Because I had built this lake house as a symbol of independence, of distance from all the obligations that used to define me. And now, that distance was collapsing, one cardboard box at a time. Outside, the lake shimmered under morning sun, pretending nothing had changed. But inside, every sound, the clinking of mugs, the squeak of drawers opening, was an invasion. I didn't know it then, but this would be the start of a quiet war. A war fought not with shouting, but with guilt, entitlement, and whispered accusations. And by the end of it, everything, the house, the family, even the meaning of home, would be rewritten. The first week was all surface calm, the kind of politeness that hums like electricity before a storm. My parents spoke softly, kept busy, moved gently around the house like guests, but I could feel it in the air, that invisible shift, the sense that something had already been claimed. It began with little changes. My mother moved the living room rug so the light would hit better, My father decided the garage needed reorganizing and shifted my labeled boxes, tools, supplies, project materials into corners he thought were more efficient. Rebecca filled the spare bedroom with pastel pillows and framed pictures of her failed marriages as if to memorialize the chaos she'd escaped. By the third day, they were speaking about the house as though it were a shared property. "We should repaint the porch," my father said one afternoon. "It's looking worn." "Now you should." "We should." That single pronoun tightened around my chest like a vice. It's strange how ownership slips away without you realizing it. Not with theft or force, but with the slow erosion of boundaries. Every morning I woke to the smell of my mother's perfume drifting through the hallway, the sound of her slippers brushing against the wood floors I'd once waxed myself. My father's radio filled the kitchen news, weather, his voice humming to the static, drowning out the silence I'd once loved. I had built this lake house to escape noise. Now it was everywhere. Rebecca spent her days lounging on the deck, talking loudly on the phone about her new start, as if my home was her springboard for recovery. I'd watch her from my office window, sipping wine at noon, the sunlight catching in her hair, her laughter carrying across the lake. Each sound was a reminder. My sanctuary had become her therapy space. At dinner, my parents would talk about family living, about togetherness, about how nice it felt to finally be under one roof again. They used those words like bandages, as if nostalgia could justify intrusion. My mother said she'd been lonely since I moved away. My father nodded, silent, like this was all a natural correction, the universe restoring what had drifted apart. But I hadn't drifted, I had escaped. Every night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the floorboards creak under their footsteps. I tried to remind myself of the sacrifices behind this house, the nights of double shifts, the years of restraint, the debts I clawed my way out of. This place was supposed to be proof that I built something on my own. And now, with each passing day, that proof was being rewritten. The turning point came on the 7th morning. I stepped into the kitchen and found my father at the table with a stack of papers, bank brochures, property tax notices, a folder labeled household finances. My name was on every document, but his hands were on every page. He looked up, calm, confident, the way he used to when I was a child and he was handling things. He said they were helping, sorting bills, simplifying paperwork, making things easier. He said it with a tone that carried authority, not permission. My mother smiled in quiet approval. Rebecca poured coffee like she was serving guests. That was the morning I realized they weren't visiting. They were moving in. And worse, they believed they had the right. The lake outside glittered in mock innocence. I remember looking out at it through the window, the waves shimmering against the shore, sunlight flashing across the ripples like tiny coins. It looked beautiful, still, serene, and completely disconnected from the quiet invasion taking place within its view. In the following days, I tried subtle resistance. I stopped restocking the pantry. I started locking my office. I claimed I was working late, but each act of defense was met with guilt. My mother's sighs turned heavier, her eyes glassy with unspoken disappointment. My father's silence grew thicker, a kind of passive reprimand that made the air heavy. Rebecca would murmur things like, "You've changed," or "You used to be so generous." That word generous clung like an accusation. It's remarkable how quickly a house can turn into a battlefield without a single argument. The war here wasn't fought in words. It was fought in rearranged furniture, in unauthorized repairs, in the sound of keys turning in doors I thought were mine. The garden I'd cultivated, my small sanctuary of hydrangeas and cedar shrubs, became my mother's project. She hired a landscaper without asking. My father painted the boathouse for aesthetics. Rebecca posted pictures of the deck on social media, captioned, "Our beautiful lakeside home." Each day, I felt myself fading from the very space I owned. My name was on the deed, but their presence was on everything else. And then came the promise. It was a Sunday afternoon. the sky pale with drifting clouds. My mother sat on the porch swing, my father beside her, both smiling with a softness that felt rehearsed. Rebecca stood nearby, her phone recording a slow pan of the lake. My mother's voice was calm when she said it. "We told Rebecca she can stay here as long as she needs. You understand, don't you?" "We told Rebecca. Not we'll ask you. Not would you mind?" I remember standing there, frozen, a single word echoing through my skull mine. But the word was useless now. Ownership wasn't about deeds or signatures anymore. It was about control. And I had already lost it. When I finally spoke, too late, too soft, too rational, the reaction was swift. My mother's face fell in disbelief, my father's eyes hardened, and Rebecca's lips trembled in performative hurt. They called me cruel. Cruel for wanting privacy. Cruel for setting boundaries. Cruel for refusing to share what was mine. By evening the air was cold. The family that had once gathered around the table in laughter now moved in silence, each gesture heavy with judgment. That night, I sat by the window again, watching the black water shimmer under the moon. The reflection of the house glowed faintly on the surface, my house, but the shadow inside it no longer belonged to me. Somewhere out on the lake, a lone loon called, long, hollow, mournful. It sounded like grief itself. I didn't know it then, but this was only the beginning. The next chapter of this quiet war would not be about space or silence. It would be about ownership. Because the moment you let people rewrite the rules of your home, they start rewriting the rules of you. And soon, the lines between generosity and surrender would vanish completely. It started with mail. At first, it was small, a few letters redirected, a couple of envelopes addressed to the Clearwater family residence. Then the bills began arriving under new names. My father's subscriptions, my mother's catalogs, even Rebecca's credit card statements. The mailbox at the end of the gravel drive, once a symbol of independence, had become a communal drop point for lives that weren't mine. Inside the house, things shifted again. The furniture, the layout, the scent, all altered under the pretense of improvement. The leather sofa, I chosen for its minimalist design, was replaced by floral upholstery. The black and steel kitchen appliances now bore lace cloths and pastel decorations. The entire aesthetic of the house, once sleek, modern, and peaceful, was softening, becoming domestic, aged, and claustrophobic. My mother called it warming up the place. But warmth wasn't what I felt. Each room carried traces of intrusion, scented candles, framed family quotes, a stack of my sister's self-help books. The once pristine surfaces were now covered in layers of sentimentality and shared memory, none of which belonged to me. It was around this time the neighbors began noticing. The lake community was tight-knit, retirees, small families, and weekend visitors who exchanged smiles across driveways. I'd once been known as the quiet one with the cedar deck. But suddenly conversations shifted. People began waving at my parents instead. Some even called the house the Thompsons' place, using my family name as though it referred to them, not me. That subtle change in language carried weight. Identity here wasn't just social, it was territorial. When neighbors started believing my parents lived here permanently, it solidified an illusion that was dangerously close to becoming truth. Rebecca helped it along. She posted videos online, slow pans of the Lakehouse, sunrise over the deck, captions like "Home is where the heart heals." Her followers commented in admiration, asking about the family Lakehouse, the beautiful retreat she shared with her parents. Every like, every repost chipped away at my claim, transforming private property into a collective fairy tale. Even the local realtor, a man I dealt with when purchasing the place, mentioned casually at the grocery store, "Your folks must be loving the Lakehouse life. So glad you let them move in." Let them. The words struck deeper than they should have. Somehow, without confrontation, I'd been written out of my own narrative. Then came the financial involvement. My father began helping with maintenance costs. He transferred small amounts for utilities, called them contributions. My mother offered to cover groceries as repayment for hospitality. I didn't realize the danger then, that every dollar they spent would later be twisted into an argument for shared stake. The emotional pressure built slowly. Whenever I tried to talk about boundaries, the guilt surfaced like clockwork. My mother's eyes would well up. "After all we've done," she'd say without words, her silence heavy with martyrdom. My father's tone would cool, rational, a warning disguised as reason. Rebecca would whisper that I was turning cold, as if protecting what was mine were cruelty incarnate. It became a pattern. Each attempt at asserting control over the house was reframed as selfishness. Every defense I raised was painted as ungratefulness, and so I stopped talking. I withdrew, confined myself to my office, the one room I refused to let them touch. But even that over time was infiltrated by their presence. My father began storing tools there temporarily. My mother dusted the shelves uninvited. Rebecca started leaving notes by my computer, little affirmations about family unity. There is a kind of psychological warfare that doesn't need shouting. It works through small acts of kindness that come wrapped in control. I began to notice how the energy in the house shifted whenever I entered a room. Conversations would pause, glances would exchange, words like ungrateful, selfish, and distant whispered faintly in the air like static. Then came the storm. It was late October when the lake turned restless, waves beating against the dock like fists. Power flickered. Rain hammered the roof with a violence that echoed my thoughts. My parents had settled into their routine, my mother knitting by the fire, my father watching the news, Rebecca scrolling endlessly through her phone. That night the breaker tripped. I went to the basement to reset it, flashlight slicing through the damp air. That's when I saw it. Boxes. My boxes labeled and stacked neatly in the corner, not in my handwriting. Each one marked with masking tape, storage. Inside were my things. Books, tools, keepsakes, even some personal files. They had been moved, packed away, hidden. I ran my hand over the box tops, feeling the cold edges, the faint scent of dust and cedar. It was as if my existence had been quietly archived, preserved out of sight, to make room for theirs. When I returned upstairs, no one mentioned it. The fire crackled, my mother smiled faintly, my father nodded at the storm outside. Rebecca was humming, lost in her phone screen. That was the night I realized they weren't guests anymore. They were settlers. And I, the rightful owner, had become the intruder. Days passed, then weeks. The storm cleared, but the air never softened. I noticed new locks on some doors. For safety, my father said. My mother began hosting small gatherings with neighbors, introducing herself as the Lady of the Lakehouse. Rebecca ordered a nameplate online, the Thompson Residence, Est, 2023, and placed it by the driveway. I didn't protest, not yet. Because I knew something they didn't. Ownership isn't erased by emotion. It's erased by documentation. And while they played at possession, I started collecting evidence. Quietly, patiently, receipts, deeds, messages, every small reminder that this place was mine, not theirs. But as I gathered proof, a darker truth began forming that this wasn't just about property, it was about history. About decades of guilt, control, and unspoken expectations. My parents weren't just moving into a lake house. They were reclaiming their version of family, the one where I was still the obedient child, grateful and compliant. And now, they had the perfect stage to perform that illusion. By December, snow blanketed the lake, muffling sound and softening edges. The house glowed warm from the outside, the perfect image of comfort. But inside I felt like a ghost haunting my own investment. Somewhere between the scent of cinnamon and pine, I made a decision. This wasn't going to be a quiet war anymore. The time for subtlety had passed. Because once you realize kindness has become a weapon, silence becomes surrender. Winter settled over the lake like a heavy secret. The shoreline froze, the air crisp and brittle, the water a still mirror that reflected the weight of silence more than beauty. Inside the lake house, the warmth of the fireplace felt counterfeit, too bright, too curated, like everything else that had been taken from me. By January, I was a stranger in my own home. My parents had fully adapted to lake life. My mother's morning routine now included opening the curtains and breathing out a soft sigh, saying something about how peaceful it all was. My father had taken ownership of the shed and garage, labeling drawers, mounting tools, and claiming projects he'd never finish. Rebecca spent her days hosting her new friends, yoga enthusiasts, local artists, small-town influencers, who adored her story of rebuilding life at the family's lakeside property. That phrase, the family's lakeside property, followed me everywhere. I heard it in conversations at the grocery store, at the post office, even from the local cafe barista who used to ask about my lake house renovations. Now, she asked if my parents enjoyed their new home. The narrative had shifted, rewritten, rehearsed, and distributed like a press release. The truth was dying under the weight of repetition. I tried subtle corrections. Yes, it's my house. I bought it myself. But people smiled politely, as if I was the one clinging to a fantasy. It was around that time I noticed how organized my family had become in shaping perception. My mother joined the community association. My father started volunteering at local maintenance meetings. Rebecca began uploading videos. Winter mornings at the lake house, mom's cozy coffee nook, dad's DIY duck repair. Each clip blurred the truth a little more. The captions read, "Our family place. We're so grateful for this chapter." Each post gathered hundreds of comments. "Such a beautiful home. You're lucky to have such a supportive family. Parents like that are rare. Cherish them." Every comment felt like a knife twisting deeper into something invisible but vital, my ownership, my narrative, my sense of control. At first, I thought it was unintentional. A misunderstanding. But as days passed, it became clear this was no accident. It was strategy. Rebecca's charm worked like oil, smooth, pleasant, impossible to grip. She spoke in gentle tones about healing together and family unity. She positioned herself as a daughter rebuilding her life with loving parents and a generous sibling. In her version of the story, I was invisible, existing only as the distant benefactor, the one who let them stay. But inside the house, reality looked different. My things continued to vanish, replaced, relocated, or quietly boxed away. The office, once my refuge, now held a second desk. My father claimed it was for bills. My mother said it looked more complete that way. Even my bedroom door had been replaced. Same frame, new lock, new key, which I never received. When I questioned it, my father called it necessary maintenance. There was no argument, just a look that said, "You're overreacting." The gaslighting came in layers, soft, subtle, and precise. If I said something was missing, they claimed to have put it somewhere safe. If I mentioned boundaries, they accused me of being distant. When I asked about my packed belongings in the basement, my mother looked hurt, my father disappointed, and Rebecca murmured, "We just wanted to help you declutter." They were erasing me under the guise of care. The first real confrontation came when I found the house listed on a short-term rental site. It was a weekday morning. I'd been in my office scrolling through emails when I stumbled upon it by accident, a local property ad, featuring professional photos of my lake house. The title read, "Luxury Family Lakefront Escape, hosted by the Thompson family." The photos were mine, my furniture, my kitchen, my view of the water. But the description made it sound like a generational property, passed through family hands, now lovingly shared with guests. The contact email wasn't mine. It was Rebecca's. I remember the stillness that followed. That hollow pause when shock gives way to disbelief, and disbelief turns to fury. When I confronted her, voice trembling but words measured, she smiled gently, as if comforting a hysterical child. She said it was just temporary income, just helping with expenses, just a family decision. My father agreed. My mother nodded. And I stood there, watching their calm faces reflect the firelight, realizing they had already rehearsed this moment. That night I couldn't sleep. The sound of the lake wind against the windows seemed to echo with laughter. Their laughter, the neighbors' laughter, the town's laughter, and my foolishness for thinking ownership meant control. The next morning the first guests arrived. A family of 4, minivan packed, smiles wide. Rebecca greeted them with tea and warmth. My mother handed them towels. My father offered to show them the dock. I watched from my office window, my pulse pounding. My home, rented out like a vacation property. I wanted to shout, to end it, to call the police, to reclaim what was mine. But I didn't, not yet. Because I realized something in that moment. This wasn't just about removing trespassers. It was about dismantling a narrative that had already taken root in the community's mind. If I acted out, I'd become the villain, the cold, ungrateful child turning on their loving family. They had built their defense on sentiment, not legality. I needed to fight with facts, not fury. So I began documenting, quietly, screenshots, receipts, photos, every violation of privacy, every rental listing, every bank transfer labeled as shared cost, because I knew this wasn't the climax, it was the build-up. And I needed evidence when the mask finally slipped. Weeks later it did. The guests left a review, 5 stars. They wrote, "Wonderful stay at the Thompson family Lakehouse. Parents are delightful hosts. Their son was rarely home, but is clearly their family's retreat. Their family's retreat." That phrase spread like wildfire across local gossip groups, and just like that, the illusion became accepted truth. I began to notice the change in tone when people spoke to me. The realtor who'd once congratulated me now said, "You're lucky to have such devoted parents keeping the place up." The mailman addressed packages to the Thompson family. Even my property insurance representative, after a routine call, referred to my parents as co-residents. They were winning, not through force, but through story. And every good story needs a villain. They were quietly casting me in that role. February came with gray skies and brittle air. The lake, half frozen, looked like a mirror that refused to reflect anything clearly, fractured, fogged, uncertain. Inside, the house had grown warmer, louder, and more suffocating. The smell of cinnamon candles and constant conversation filled every room, every corner, every breath. I was no longer living at the lake house. I was surviving inside it. The day I realized I needed legal help came when I found a notice pinned to the fridge. It was a utility transfer confirmation. The water account had been updated to include another name, my father's. No one had asked. No one had mentioned it. It was just done. A small thing maybe, to anyone else. But I knew what it meant. Paper trails become proof. And proof builds claims. That night, I sat alone at the dining table long after everyone had gone to bed. The flickering light from the fireplace moved across the wood like a heartbeat. I took out every document I had, the deed, the purchase receipts, the mortgage statements, my name, my money, my signature. And yet, the walls around me no longer listened to that truth. Because ownership doesn't feel like ownership when no one else believes it. The next morning I drove into town. The cold air bit at my face as I parked outside a small brick office marked Henderson and Myers, real estate attorneys. Inside the warmth was stale, heavy with the scent of paper and carpet glue. The attorney, gray suit, patient eyes, listened quietly as I explained everything. He didn't interrupt. He didn't blink. When I finished, he leaned back and exhaled. "You're not the first," he said softly. "Family occupation cases, they're the hardest kind. No physical violence, no written agreement, but the emotional manipulation. That's their weapon. It's slow, it's quiet, and by the time you act, the public perception's already gone." He explained that legally, my case was clear. The title, the mortgage, the purchase, all mine. But the longer they stayed, the more complicated it became. In court, perception mattered. Judges were human. Sympathy swayed them. A family living together sounded wholesome, not hostile. He advised documentation, restraint, and patience. Don't confront emotionally, record everything. Paper wins wars. That phrase stayed with me. Paper wins wars. When I left his office, the air outside felt sharper, cleaner. I had a direction now, not revenge, not confrontation, but precision. Over the next weeks, I became a shadow in my own home. I photographed everything, the mail, the guest logs, the online listings, even the casual conversations where my parents referred to the place as ours. I created a folder labeled proof of possession. But the more evidence I collected, the more invisible I became. My mother noticed my distance first. "You've grown cold," she said one morning, her voice laced with disappointment. "You used to smile more." My father stayed quiet, but his silence had an edge now, one sharpened by suspicion. Rebecca, always intuitive, began probing with small questions. "You've been gone a lot lately. Everything okay?" They could feel the shift, even if they couldn't name it. Then one evening, I overheard a conversation that confirmed what I'd begun to fear. It was late, around midnight. I'd gone downstairs for water when I heard their voices from the living room. The fire had burned low, throwing weak orange light across the walls. My father's tone was calm but firm. "He's getting distant." "I think he's planning something," Rebecca replied softly. "We need to protect ourselves, Dad. Legally, maybe." My mother's voice, weary, followed. "We gave him everything. If he wants to throw us out now, that's on him. But people will see who's really heartless." That word, heartless, struck like a gavel. They were preparing their narrative, laying emotional groundwork. Not just for me, but for everyone else. The next day, the whispers began. Neighbors who once waved now avoided eye contact. The local grocery clerk hesitated before greeting me. One even said, "Heard your folks are having a rough time. Hope you're not pushing them out." They loved that Lakehouse. The story had evolved. In their version, I was evicting them. The generous parents, the struggling sister. They were victims now. I was the ungrateful child. It was clever, strategic, brutal, but I didn't break. Not yet. Instead, I called the attorney again. He advised me to send a formal notice of occupancy termination, a gentle legal reminder of who held ownership. He said to deliver it quietly, through the proper channels, and never to engage emotionally. So I did. 2 days later, an envelope arrived at the house, addressed to me but stamped with the firm's logo. Inside was the printed notice. Simple, factual, professional. When I handed it to my parents, the air in the room froze. My mother's eyes filled with tears before she'd even read it. My father's jaw tightened. Rebecca stood motionless, expression unreadable. "This is unnecessary," my mother whispered, voice trembling. "You're choosing paperwork over family?" I said nothing. I couldn't, because the truth was, yes, that's exactly what I was doing. Paperwork was all I had left. My father placed the notice on the table, folded it once, and looked at me with quiet disbelief. "After all we've done for you," he said softly, almost to himself. Then he left the room. The silence that followed was thick and unbearable. My mother began crying quietly. Rebecca placed a hand on her shoulder, whispering, "He doesn't mean it." But her eyes met mine, calm, deliberate, almost victorious. Because she knew something I didn't want to admit. In family wars, the first person to show emotion wins the audience. And I had just become the villain again. That night, the tension was suffocating. I could feel their resentment in every sound, the closing of doors, the shuffling of feet, the creak of the staircase. The house itself seemed to recoil from me, siding with them. In bed, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint wind outside. I thought about what my lawyer said, that these battles were long, draining, and often lonely. That family entitlement was a slow-moving storm, one that eroded foundations before you even realized they were cracking. But I also knew this: storms pass. And when they do, Only the structures built on truth remained standing. So I waited, patiently, silently. The eviction notice wasn't the end, it was the signal flare. And somewhere deep inside that cold February night, I knew the real battle for the Lakehouse had just begun. The notice detonated quietly. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation, just a change in atmosphere, an invisible tension that thickened the air, made every breath feel like trespass. For 2 days the house was silent. My parents moved around with mechanical grace, polite but cold. Rebecca stopped humming. Meals were taken separately. The scent of my mother's cooking, once cloying now strangely comforting, no longer drifted through the hallways. Then, on the third morning, the retaliation began. It started with a post. Rebecca uploaded a photo of the lake house bathed in soft morning light. The caption read, "When your own blood turns against you, remember, kindness still wins. Grateful for parents who taught me love, even when others forget what family means." The comments poured in, condolences, outrage, pity. "Stay strong, girl. Some people just don't appreciate what they have. You'll get through this." By noon, my mother had shared the post. By evening, my father had received calls from old family friends expressing sympathy. The story had traveled faster than truth ever could. I didn't respond. Because the moment you defend yourself publicly against family, you've already lost the audience. But inside, something fractured. Neighbors who once smiled now looked away. A local pastor stopped by, just to talk, his tone soft, his eyes heavy with quiet disapproval. Even the mailman's glances felt longer, more curious. I had become the villain of a story I didn't write. My parents never confronted me directly. They didn't need to. Their strength lay in subtlety, the silent weapon of hurt dignity. My mother's sighs grew heavier, my father's silences longer. Rebecca perfected her expression of weary sadness, the kind that made onlookers want to protect her. Every act of self-preservation I took became another proof of cruelty. When I stopped joining dinners, my mother told the neighbors I'd become distant. When I changed the Wi-Fi password after discovering their devices hosting rental listings, my father told people I was trying to control everything. When I began spending nights in the guest room just to sleep without hearing whispered conversations, Rebecca posted a quote about the loneliness of selfish hearts. They didn't need lawyers. They had public sympathy. And sympathy, in a small lake community, was currency. Within a week, the ripple effect had reached my workplace. An old colleague texted, "Everything okay at home?" Saw some things online. The sentence carried concern, but also judgment, the kind that clings and spreads. I wanted to scream, to fight, to post my own truth with screenshots, receipts, evidence. But something inside me stopped, a quiet voice that reminded me, dignity doesn't shout. Instead I documented, quietly, methodically. Each rumor, each online post, each subtle lie. I archived them all. But the house itself began to shift again. My parents started locking certain rooms, their rooms, as they called them. My mother moved her bedroom furniture into what had once been the guest suite. My father installed a small filing cabinet in the study, my study, with folders labeled house maintenance and expenses. The illusion of shared ownership was no longer illusion. It was infrastructure. And then came the letter. It arrived one afternoon in a cream-colored envelope addressed not to me, but to the residents of 214 Clearwater Drive. Inside was a note from a family lawyer representing my parents, not aggressive, not threatening, just suggestive. It stated that my parents had contributed financially and materially to the upkeep of the property and were establishing proof of co-residency. It was phrased gently, legally poisoned, wrapped in politeness. I stared at it for a long time, feeling something cold unfurl behind my ribs. This was no longer an emotional conflict. It was a tactical siege. My lawyer called it a move to muddy ownership. He advised patience again, documentation, careful communication. But patience by then felt like surrender. That evening, I walked through my own home and barely recognized it. The walls were covered in framed family photos I hadn't hung. The bookshelves held novels I didn't own. Even the kitchen pantry contained ingredients I never bought. Their brands, their preferences, their habits. It was as if my identity had been exorcised from the house, replaced by a version of family history rewritten without me. And yet the irony was cruel. The deed, the taxes, the mortgage, every legal proof still carried my name. But names, I learned, meant nothing when stories were stronger. The breaking point came a week later. I returned home one evening to find strangers on the deck, two couples laughing over wine, snapping pictures of the lake. Rebecca was hosting them, bright-voiced, radiant, telling the same story she told online. How the family had inherited this place, how we maintained it with love. When she saw me, she smiled, the kind of smile that hides a dagger. Didn't think you'd be home so early. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I went upstairs instead, closed my door, and stood there in silence as the sound of laughter echoed through the house I bought with my own hands. Somewhere between anger and disbelief, I realized this wasn't about winning anymore, it was about ending. The next day, I made a decision. I contacted my lawyer again. This time, I didn't ask for advice, I gave instructions. I wanted a formal eviction notice drafted, filed, and served through official channels. No warning, no explanation. Because kindness had been weaponized long enough. When the papers arrived 3 days later, I didn't hand them over gently. I left them on the kitchen table, next to the same bowl of fruit that had sat there for months, untouched. Decorative, symbolic of everything that looked real but wasn't. The reaction was immediate. My mother's tears were no longer silent. My father's restraint snapped, his voice rising in disbelief and wounded pride. Rebecca's composure fractured, her tone cutting, venomous, accusing. How could you do this to your own family? She said. I didn't respond. Because explaining truth to those committed to falsehood is like shouting into the wind. That night, I left the house and slept in my car by the lake. The cold crept through the windows, the air heavy with the scent of pine and frozen water. The lights of the Lakehouse glowed faintly in the distance, a warm golden light shimmering against the dark. I realized, for the first time, that maybe reclaiming the house meant losing the family. And maybe that was the price. The day the summons went out, the lake was still. A cold fog rolled in from the water, erasing the shoreline, swallowing sound. The world outside looked blurred, and maybe that was fitting. Clarity had become a luxury I could no longer afford. The eviction had crossed from emotion into law. Within 48 hours, my phone began to buzz relentlessly. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years, aunts from distant cities, even family friends who barely remembered my birthday, all reaching out, their messages carrying the same tone of disbelief. Why are you doing this to your parents? They love that house. Can't you just let them stay? No one asked what really happened. They didn't need to. The narrative was already written. Rebecca had seen to that. She became the family's publicist, her posts more polished, her tone more sorrowful, her reach broader than ever. We never imagined it would come to this, she wrote. Sometimes, when money and pride mix, love gets lost in the middle. It spread fast, reposted, shared, screenshotted. I didn't even need to look anymore. The notifications told me the story was alive and thriving, each share another brick in the wall between truth and perception. Meanwhile, my lawyer prepared the filings. The paperwork was sterile, impersonal, lines of text that reduced months of emotional warfare into bullet-pointed facts. Property address, 214 Clearwater Drive ownership, sole occupants, unauthorized, non-leaseholders action, eviction, but behind each line was a lifetime of exhaustion. When the official notice reached my parents' attorney, the silence inside the Lakehouse shattered. My mother refused to speak to me. My father avoided eye contact. Rebecca's presence turned predatory, silent one moment, calculatedly kind the next. The house became divided, Two worlds under one roof. They occupied the common spaces, the kitchen, the living room, the deck. I confined myself to my room and my office, moving quietly, timing my steps to avoid collision. Even the floorboards seemed to groan in protest whenever we passed each other. Then came the first court date. It was scheduled for early March, in a small municipal building by the main road, a place where fishing licenses and property disputes shared the same courtroom. The drive there felt endless, the silence in the car unbearable. I remember gripping the steering wheel, my fingers stiff from the cold, my pulse pounding through my palms. My parents arrived separately. They didn't look at me when they entered. Rebecca followed them, her phone in hand, her expression soft enough to draw sympathy from strangers. The hearing was brief, procedural, not emotional. The judge, an older man with sharp glasses and a neutral voice, asked questions in clipped sentences. My lawyer answered calmly, factually. He presented deeds, payment records, renovation invoices. On paper, the case was airtight. But law doesn't account for guilt. When my mother took the stand, her voice trembled, not from fear, but from mastery. She spoke of temporary arrangements, of a son who changed, of a misunderstanding that had grown too large. My father nodded solemnly. Rebecca dabbed her eyes with a tissue she didn't need. Every word they spoke carried weight, not because it was true, but because it sounded human. And human pain, even when manufactured, fills the air heavier than any legal argument. I didn't speak. My lawyer advised silence. But as I sat there listening to their version of events, how I'd supposedly invited them to share the home, how they had helped maintain it, how I was now forcing them out in the dead of winter, I felt a slow, corrosive anger build inside me. When the judge called for recess, I stepped outside. The air was sharp, the lake visible in the distance through bare trees. For the first time, I wondered if winning was worth the isolation it demanded. Back inside, the judge postponed final judgment, citing emotional and familial complexity. The next hearing was set for 3 weeks later. 3 more weeks of cohabitation. 3 more weeks of silent war. Back at the house, the atmosphere curdled. My parents spoke only to each other. Rebecca began packing small boxes, performatively loudly, ensuring I heard every tape pull, every sigh. Sometimes she left her door open, letting the sound echo through the hallway like an accusation. Then, one night, I heard her speaking softly on the phone, her voice trembling just enough to sound genuine. He doesn't even look at Mom anymore. It's like we're strangers. She cries every night. She knew I could hear. The next morning, a neighbor dropped by with groceries. For your parents must be tough for them. Tough for them. It was remarkable how efficiently guilt replaced ownership. By the second week, even the lake seemed to turn against me. Ice cracked at night like distant thunder. The house groaned under the weight of wind. Everything, even nature, felt complicit in my isolation. Then came the letter from the judge. The decision was delayed. A mediator was being assigned. The court wanted to pursue reconciliation before resolution. Reconciliation. The word felt like mockery. Rebecca celebrated online with a post. Sometimes the universe pauses conflict to remind us what truly matters, love. The comments were endless. You're such a good daughter. Family always wins in the end. I turned off my phone. That night, I sat on the deck staring at the lake, half frozen, half alive, and thought about everything I'd built, everything I was losing. Not just property, but peace. The house behind me glowed faintly with warm light, silhouettes moving in the windows, the family that had taken everything but still called it love. I realized then that this battle wasn't just about who owned the house. It was about who got to define the story of it. And as long as their version existed, mine would remain unfinished. But stories, like property, could be reclaimed. I just hadn't decided yet how far I was willing to go to do it. End of Chapter 7. Natural break. The legal battle has begun but remains unresolved. Chapter 8 will open with the mediator's arrival, the exposure of private manipulation, and the narrator's first steps toward reclaiming both truth and authority. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 8? Where the mediation process reveals hidden lies, the sister's influence begins to crack, and the narrator starts turning the psychological tide in their favor. You said, continue, ChatGPT said. Excellent, bye. Here's Chapter 8, continuing the same rich, atmospheric narration in the tone of a high-drama property story as the mediation begins and cracks appear in the family's united front. Chapter 8. The cracks beneath the surface. The mediator arrived on a gray morning in late March, carrying a clipboard, a neutral smile, and the scent of cold rain. Her car tires crunched over the gravel driveway, stopping just shy of the deck where so many of our unspoken wars had begun. She was polite, professional, and calm, the kind of calm that seemed immune to tension, immune to tears. Her name was Miss Porter. She wore gray wool, silver-rimmed glasses, and a face that revealed nothing. For a moment, the Lakehouse seemed still, the air tense with expectation, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Inside, my mother had arranged the living room as if for company, flowers on the table, candles burning faintly, the air perfumed with something floral and sweet. My father sat stiffly on the couch, expression carved from stone. Rebecca perched in the corner chair, her phone face down on her knee, her smile rehearsed. I stood by the window, watching the lake. When Miss Porter entered, her presence filled the room with a kind of uneasy order. She greeted each of us, her tone even, her words deliberate. Then she took a seat, opened her folder, and began. Her first questions were simple, practical: dates, names, financial records. She wanted a timeline of how it began, when my parents moved in, what had been agreed upon, what had changed. Each question was a thread, and as she pulled, the tapestry of illusion began to unravel. My father spoke first. Calmly, rationally. He explained that they'd been invited temporarily, that they had helped maintain and support the property, and that things had spiraled due to misunderstandings. My mother nodded, her eyes glassy. Rebecca added small interjections, words like support, family, healing. Miss Porter listened without emotion, writing in steady strokes of blue ink. When it was my turn, I spoke plainly. I explained the purchase, the mortgage, the renovation, the payments. I described the first visit, the boxes, the unannounced move-in, the slow erosion of ownership. I told her about the mail, the furniture, the short-term rentals, the online posts. No anger, no emotion. Just the truth, word by word, brick by brick. When I finished, silence filled the room. My mother's tears broke it. She pressed a handkerchief to her face, trembling softly. My father looked away. Rebecca sat perfectly still, her hand tightening on the armrest, her jaw locked. Miss Porter looked up from her notes. She asked Rebecca directly, "Did you manage any rental listings for this property?" Rebecca blinked. "I helped promote it online. It was to help with costs." We thought, so there was income generated? Miss Porter's tone remained polite but firm. Rebecca hesitated. A little, maybe once or twice. It wasn't official. That pause, that hesitation hung in the air like smoke. My father's composure wavered. My mother's tears slowed. Miss Porter made another note, her pen moving with surgical precision. "Thank you," she said finally. "Please continue." But the rhythm of the meeting had changed. The unity they rehearsed began to falter. Each question peeled away another layer of pretense. Who handled utilities? Who paid for repairs? Who authorized modifications? The answers came unevenly, contradicting, stumbling. The narrative of shared maintenance began to crack under the weight of evidence. My documents, printed and stapled neatly, spoke louder than any emotion. After 2 hours, Miss Porter closed her folder and exhaled softly. "This situation," she said, "has clearly gone beyond misunderstanding. I'll be recommending formal separation of residence. For everyone's peace." No one spoke. My mother stared at her lap. My father's hands tightened on his knees. Rebecca's expression remained fixed calm, but her eyes betrayed something fragile beneath. When Miss Porter left, the silence that followed felt different this time, not heavy, but hollow. The sound of inevitability. Later that evening, I found Rebecca on the deck. The sun was setting, a pale orange disk melting behind the trees, the lake catching its reflection like a wound. She was staring out at it, her phone still in her hand, her shoulders slumped. For the first time since this began, she looked small. Inside, my parents were packing quietly, not openly, but instinctively, as if they already knew what was coming. The illusion of control, of possession, had begun to dissolve. That night, I couldn't sleep. I wandered through the house. The same house that had once felt invaded, now eerily empty. Every sound was familiar again, every wall echoed differently. But the victory didn't feel like triumph, it felt like loss. Because underneath all the bitterness and betrayal, a truth lingered. I had wanted peace, not punishment. I had wanted space, not exile. I had wanted my family to respect what I built, not destroy it to prove their love. The following week, Miss Porter filed her report. The judge accepted her recommendation. The eviction would proceed formally, with relocation assistance offered to my parents as a courtesy. When the notice arrived, there were no outbursts this time, no tears, no shouting, just quiet acceptance. My father signed a few papers, his movements slow, deliberate. My mother folded her hands, staring at the floor. Rebecca stood behind them, her expression unreadable. Within days, the packing began. The floral rugs disappeared, the candles vanished, the endless family photos were removed from the walls. The Lakehouse began to look like itself again, stripped of sentiment, returning to simplicity. But as boxes piled near the door, the silence grew unbearable. On the final morning, I watched them load the car. The lake shimmered behind them, gray, vast, indifferent. My mother looked up once, her eyes meeting mine briefly. There was no anger there, only exhaustion. "We just wanted to feel close to you," she said softly. I said nothing. Because the truth was cruel. Closeness, forced without respect, isn't love. It's possession. When they drove away, the gravel crunched under the tires, the same sound I'd heard the day they arrived, but this time fading instead of approaching. I stood there long after the car disappeared. The lake was quiet again, the house still. And for the first time in months, I breathed. It wasn't joy. It wasn't victory. It was release. Inside, the air felt light, hollow, raw, like the space left behind after a storm passes. But even then, somewhere deep inside, I knew this wasn't truly over. Because while paper wins wars, memory keeps wounds open. And the world, the neighbors, the relatives, the followers, still believed their story. I had reclaimed my house. But not yet my name. Spring came slowly that year. The ice melted in pieces, drifting like forgotten memories across the surface of the lake. The air grew softer, the light warmer, but the silence inside the lake house remained. They were gone. For the first time in months, every sound was my own again. The hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the deck, the faint whisper of wind slipping through the cedar trees. The house no longer carried voices, no footsteps, no sighs of resentment. But it also no longer felt alive. Ownership had returned, yes, legally, physically, undeniably. But peace? Peace felt more like an echo than a presence. In the mornings, I sit by the window with coffee and stare out at the water. The same view that once brought pride now carried a strange kind of grief. Because what had been reclaimed was not untouched, it was scarred, haunted by the memory of what it took to keep it. The neighbors still waved, but with caution. Their smiles were thinner, their greetings shorter. The story had settled into the community like sediment at the bottom of a still lake, impossible to stir without muddying everything. Some avoided me altogether. Others nodded politely, but never met my eyes. They had heard one version of events, the version told through whispers, social posts, and sympathetic retellings. The version where I had become the cold, greedy child who evicted his aging parents for control of a property. It didn't matter that the truth was written in deeds and documents. In small towns, emotion outruns evidence. At the local cafe, I overheard things, softly spoken, never direct. Shame, really. Families shouldn't fight over money. He could have just let them stay. I heard the sister had to move in with friends. Poor thing. Each sentence was another stone on my chest. I didn't correct them. I didn't defend myself. I simply paid for my coffee and left, the bell above the door chiming in quiet accusation. Back at the Lakehouse, I tried to fill the silence with purpose. I sanded the deck, repainted the living room, cleared out the storage room where my things had been buried under theirs. Each task was an act of reclamation, not just of space, but of identity. Still, every nail I hammered, every brushstroke I made, carried the ghost of memory. I could see them here, my father at the table, my mother arranging flowers, Rebecca staring out over the water. The walls remembered them, even if I wanted to forget. One evening, as the sun set over the lake in streaks of orange and violet, I found a small box tucked behind a cabinet. Inside were photographs, old family ones. Vacations, birthdays, even one of the Lakehouse from their first visit. In every picture we were smiling. For a long time I just sat there on the floor, staring at those frozen moments. It struck me then that every conflict begins as love, and that love, when mixed with entitlement, becomes poison. They hadn't meant to destroy me. They had simply believed they were entitled to what I built, because they had once built me. That realization hurt more than the betrayal itself. A week later, a letter arrived. It was from Rebecca. It wasn't an apology, not exactly. Just a page of carefully chosen words, written in her looping handwriting. I still believe you misunderstood us, she wrote. But maybe we misunderstood you too. I hope the house brings you peace. Maybe one day, you'll see that all we wanted was to be part of it. No address, no phone number. Just that. I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer by my bed, not to remember her, but to remember the lesson. Ownership isn't about walls or deeds or furniture. It's about boundaries, invisible lines between love and control, generosity and guilt. And once those lines are crossed, even family can become strangers. By summer, the Lakehouse began to feel whole again. I opened the windows each morning and let the air in, the clean smell of pine and water, the sound of loons calling across the lake. The house no longer echoed with the noise of intrusion. Sometimes, I'd hear distant laughter from the other side of the lake, families renting cottages, living their temporary happiness. It made me smile faintly without envy. Because I finally understood something simple and brutal. You can rebuild a house after a storm. But rebuilding yourself, that takes silence. And in that silence, something new was forming. Not the pride I once felt, but something steadier. A kind of quiet ownership that didn't need validation or witnesses. One evening, as dusk fell and the first stars appeared over the lake, I turned off all the lights and stood by the window. The reflection staring back at me was clear this time, not blurred, not uncertain. It was me, alone, free, and for the first time I didn't see that as loneliness. I saw it as peace earned the hard way. Summer deepened quietly that year. The days stretched long and golden. The evenings painted in soft amber light that lingered on the water until it dissolved into dusk. The lake had healed faster than I had. Its surface, once fractured with ice, now lay still and bright, reflecting everything without judgment. The house too had changed. It no longer carried the scent of foreign candles or the clutter of someone else's comfort. The walls were bare again, the air simple, the furniture minimal, a return to the way I'd first envisioned it. Yet it felt different now, not new, not old. Just honest. I spent mornings repairing what winter had left behind, tightening loose deck boards, repainting the boathouse door, scrubbing the windows until they caught the sun. There was satisfaction in the work, not the pride of ownership, but the quiet rhythm of belonging. Some weekends, I'd take the canoe out across the water, drifting in silence. From the center of the lake, the house looked small, a single shape among trees, nothing grand, nothing imposing. Just a place, a shelter, a reminder. I'd learned to love it differently now, not as proof of success, but as a companion to solitude. The world outside had moved on mostly. The gossip had dulled, replaced by new stories, new scandals, new names. The neighbors still waved, some with lingering awkwardness, others with quiet understanding. Life, as it always does, had found new rhythms. But there were traces left, echoes of a storm that had once shaken more than walls. A few locals still saw me as the son who'd thrown his family out. Others avoided mention of it altogether, as if silence could erase discomfort. I didn't correct them. I didn't need to anymore. Truth doesn't always need to be spoken. Sometimes it just needs to endure. One afternoon, as I trimmed the hedge by the gravel path, a car pulled into the drive, slow, cautious, a familiar model. My pulse quickened before my mind caught up. It was my mother. She stepped out carefully, older somehow, the sun catching silver in her hair. She wore a soft blue sweater and carried nothing, no bags, no flowers, no expectations. For a moment, we simply looked at each other across the space that used to be filled with tension. The gravel crunched under her feet as she walked closer. "I just wanted to see the lake again," she said quietly. Her voice was smaller than I remembered. I nodded and gestured toward the deck. We sat without speaking, the wind moving gently through the trees, the water calm and endless before us. After a long silence, she sighed. "We shouldn't have stayed as long as we did. We thought we were helping." I said nothing. There was nothing left to argue about. The truth had already settled, not in words but in time. She looked at me then, eyes soft but tired. "Your father's not well these days. He misses this place. Rebecca too. She's moved to the city." Her words hung in the air like drifting leaves. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small key, old, brass, familiar, my spare house key. The one they never returned. She placed it on the table between us. "For closure," she said simply. The gesture was small, but it landed like thunder. Not because it changed anything legally, but because it closed a wound that paper never could. We sat a while longer, watching the water shift under the light. When she finally stood to leave, I didn't stop her. She smiled faintly, a tired human smile, and drove away, the sound of tires fading into the quiet hum of the summer air. I watched until the car disappeared, then looked down at the key still glinting on the table. For a long moment, I didn't move. Then I picked it up, turned it over in my hand, and placed it inside the drawer beside Rebecca's letter. Not as a reminder of pain, but of balance. The past, after all, is a foundation, not a prison. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, I walked out onto the deck. The lake shimmered under the fading light, its surface smooth and endless. The air smelled of cedar and cool water. For the first time, I didn't feel haunted. The house behind me stood silent, steady, not fragile, not fearful, but at peace. Its windows glowed with the soft light of a single lamp, its reflection rippling gently across the lake like a signature returned to its rightful owner. I thought of everything that had happened, the promises, the manipulation, the guilt, the legal battles, the loneliness. Every moment had been a storm breaking something inside me, but also clearing something out. This place wasn't just my home anymore. It was my proof that boundaries can be rebuilt, that peace can return, and that love, even when it hurts, doesn't have to be lost forever. I stood there until night fell, the sound of crickets rising from the trees, the moon lifting above the lake like a quiet blessing. When I finally turned to go inside, the house greeted me not as property, but as something deeper. A mirror of everything I had learned, everything I had endured, and everything I was finally ready to let go of. The war was over. The silence had won. And this time, it felt like home.